HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Death in the Rainforest, How a Language and a Way of Life Came to an End in Papua New Guinea, by Don Kulick, read by Paul Woodson. Foreword. For over 30 years I visited a small village deep inside the rainforest of Papua New Guinea, a country that lies not in Africa, as people often believe, but in the Pacific Ocean just north of Australia, to discover how a language dies. The village I came to know during the course of those years is called Gapun. The people who live there all used to speak a unique language that they call Tayap. For all we know, Tayap may be as old as Greek, Chinese, or Latin, but the coming decades will see Tayap die. Currently the language has fewer than 50 active speakers. Soon, all that will be heard of Tayap ever again are the recordings that I have made over the years. They will linger on like ectoplasm, long after the speakers are gone and the language is forgotten. I first went to Gapun as a graduate student in anthropology in the mid-1980s, and I spent over a year living there then. I wrote a book about what I discovered. It is a good book, a solid study, still well worth reading. But it is an academic book aimed at professional anthropologists and linguists and university students. Its eye-numbing title, Language Shift and Cultural Reproduction, which I attribute to an unhappy combination of eager youthful ambition to appear scholarly and terrible editorial advice, says it all. This time I'm writing from hindsight, a different kind of book, one that tells a story about what has happened in Gapun in the years since I first visited, and about how the Tayap language is fizzling inexorably to its end. But this book also tells the story of my work in the village, and why that too has come to an end. Both endings are bound up with violence. On the one hand, there is the material and symbolic violence that the coming of white men to Papua New Guinea has wrought on the people there, their cultures and their languages. On the other hand, there are local acts of violence, perpetrated by villagers themselves and their neighbors that harm the villagers, and that have harmed or threatened to harm me too. All these forms of violence course like subterranean flows of magma that occasionally gush up and burst through the surface of the stories I tell here. Those stories are about what it is like to live in a difficult-to-get-to village of 200 people, carved out like a cleft in a swamp in the middle of a tropical rainforest. They're stories about what the people who live in that village eat for breakfast and how they sleep. They're stories about how villagers discipline their children, how they joke with one another, and how they swear at one another. They are stories about how villagers romance one another, how they worship, how they argue, how they die, and also how they made sense of a white anthropologist who appeared one day out of nowhere, saying he was interested in their language and asking their leave to stick around for a while. A while that ended up extending over 3 decades. Can one speak for another? Since I wrote my first book about Gapun 25 years ago, a sometimes rancorous discussion has erupted both inside the academy and outside it, about the legitimacy of writing about a group of people to whom one as a researcher does not oneself belong. Long gone are the magisterial days of departed anthropologists like Margaret Mead, whose attitude about the people she worked with was neatly summed up in an article she published in 1939 in the professional journal American Anthropologist. Mead wrote in response to one of her colleagues' claims that for anthropological work to be believable, anthropologists needed to learn the languages spoken by the people among whom they did field work. Margaret Mead thought that earnest counsel like that was nonsense. She waved it away like an irritating housefly. All the fuss about learning native languages was intimidating to anthropology students and just plain wrong-headed. It wasn't necessary. To do their job, Mead insisted, anthropologists don't need to know a language. They just need to use a language. And to use a language requires only 3 things. First of all, you need to be able to ask questions in order to get an answer with the smallest amount of dickering. What you were supposed to make of those answers, if you didn't speak the language in which they were delivered, was not something that Mead seemingly bothered herself about. The second thing Mead thought that an anthropologist needed to use a language for is to establish rapport, especially in the houses of strangers, where one wishes the maximum non-interference with one's note-taking and photography. The final thing you need to use a language to do, this is my favorite, is to give instructions. Invoking an era when natives knew their place and didn't dare mess with bossy anthropologists, Mead offered this crisp advice. If the ethnologist cannot give quick and accurate instructions to his native servants, informants, and assistants, cannot tell them to find the short lens for the Leica, its position accurately described, to put the tripod down sun from the place where the ceremony is to take place, to get a fresh razor blade and the potassium permanganate crystals, and bring them quickly in case of snake bite. Wouldn't you love to know how she barked that in Samoan? To boil and filter the water which is to be used for mixing a developer, he will waste an enormous amount of time and energy doing mechanical tasks which he could have delegated if his tongue had been just a little bit better schooled. Since Mead's time, she died in 1978, and partly in response to the imperious hubris with which she and other anthropologists of her era presented the people they wrote about, scholars, as well as some of the women and men who provided anthropologists with the material about which they wrote, have raised the thorny issue of speaking for others. Can one do it? Should one? I am a white American, European, middle-class male professor writing about largely moneyless, which is not the same as poor, black villagers who live in a backwater swamp in a faraway oceanic country. The immense differences between me and the people whose lives I describe here mean that all the triggers are present from the outset. The ground is strewn with easily visible mines. Like most card-carrying anthropologists, however, I remain committed to the spirit of Margaret Mead's conviction that we not only can, but we should, indeed we have a responsibility to, engage with and represent people who are very unlike ourselves. If anthropology, as a way of approaching the world, has a single message, it is that we learn from difference. Difference enriches. It disquiets, it expands, it amplifies, it transforms. Engaging with difference respectfully always necessarily entails risks, political and epistemological risks. You might get it all wrong. Representational risks. How do you describe people, including their idiosyncrasies or shortcomings, in a dignified manner without being patronizing, hagiographic, or sentimental? And personal risks. Encounters with difference are frequently transformative in unpredictable and sometimes even undesired ways. Plus, you incur responsibilities and long-term, often unrequitable debts. Those are all serious risks. They need to be acknowledged, embraced, and constantly kept in mind. But considering the alternative of not engaging with difference, of ignoring it, refusing it, shying away from it, or denying it, the question is whether the higher risk is not taking those risks at all. Besides, rather than speak for the villagers I write about, this book engages with them. This book is about what it is like to work as an anthropologist in a Papua New Guinean rainforest, living among a group of people who continually reminded me, regardless of whatever views I or anyone else may entertain about the matter, that I was not so different from them at all. My white skin and white privilege for the villagers were not primarily a symbol of difference. On the contrary, the fact that I appeared among them at all was a sign that I in reality was one of them, and throughout my stays with them, they drew me inexorably into their circuits of exchange, responsibility, and accountability. This book is one way I have attempted to extend that exchange, fulfill that responsibility, and make myself accountable. My hope is that the story I tell here provides not just an explanation, but also a sense of how it is that the particular fate I describe has befallen the Tayap language and Gapun. To these specific people, at this specific time, in this specific place. I also hope that the book conveys something of the curiosity and delight, as well as of the frustration, anxiety, and occasionally the sheer terror that I experienced during my stays in the village during the years I kept returning. When anthropologists write about their work, They tend to accentuate the positive, and airbrush out the most difficult aspects of living for a long time with people whom they have, in effect, gate-crashed on and set up shop among. This book is different. 1. The air we breathe. All you have to do is fill in this form, and the company will come in and start taking your air, the fat, wannabe corrupt politician explained to the villagers. He was sitting on the floor of a men's house, a large open-air structure on stilts made out of bark and thatched with sago palm leaves. The wannabe corrupt politician, who was visiting from a neighboring village, was a balding man in his mid-40s. He had run several times for a seat in the provincial parliament, but he always lost to someone else who came to the area right before the election and promised to give people more money and outboard motors than Mr. Wannabe had thought to promise them. The victor proceeded to engorge his own bank account from the access he gained, by winning the election, to government and NGO money earmarked for development, and was never heard from again. Mr. Wannabe's ambition was to be a politician like that, and he was convinced that one day he would succeed. In the meantime, he buttered up the corrupt politicians who did win a seat in the provincial elections, and set his sights on more local forms of expropriation. His ample paunch testified to years of successfully coaxing money out of villagers for schemes he'd convinced them would bring change. The only change they ever saw was that they had less money after his visits than they had before he came. That the promised changes somehow never materialized was always blamed on someone else. A corrupt politician lied. Somebody stole the money. A sorcerer bewitched it and made it disappear. Sitting in the men's house, scratching his back against a corner post, Mr. Wannabe was sweating profusely. This wasn't because he was nervous. He had been in this men's house many times before, and he knew how to sweet-talk the villagers. He was sweating because he was fat and the late afternoon sun was hot. He was also sweating because his mouth was stuffed full of betel nut, which stimulates like caffeine, and it makes you perspire. It also turns your mouth scarlet red and your teeth rust black. The villagers who had come to the meeting didn't say much. They just listened as the man, Onjani, whom they called Big Belly behind his back, told them why he had come. The 20 or so village men scattered throughout the men's house sat like Big Belly, cross-legged on the floor. They grouped themselves in small half-circle clusters, and they were also chewing betel nut, occasionally leaning forward to bend over at the waist and eject a well-aimed stream of blood-colored spittle through the cracks in the bark floor. Women sat spread out on the porches of houses within hearing distance. They were chewing betel nut, too, listening to the talk in the men's house with one ear, and keeping the other tuned in to the cutting comments that their neighbors muttered below their breath, as Onjani spoke. "I'm here to make awareness," Onjani announced, speaking in Tok Pisin, the national language of Papua New Guinea, and using a new word, awareness, that he had picked up in one of the NGO, or church or government-sponsored courses that he constantly let it be known he attended in the faraway provincial capital, which only a few villagers had ever visited. He had just come back from the capital, he said, and there he had participated in a 3-day course on something else new, something called carbon trade. Onjani told the villagers that they ought to know that carbon trade had become a big thing in the countries, old country, by which he meant every place in the world outside Papua New Guinea. The countries, he said, were running out of air. The factories that covered practically every inch of ground there had used up all the air. There were no more trees, and trees, Onjani reminded everybody, make air. Without trees there would be no air. People in the countries were finding it increasingly hard to breathe. Papua New Guinea, on the other hand, was full of trees. Onjani leaned forward over his crossed legs and dribbled red spit through a crack in the floor. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, spreading a crimson stain across his chin. He swept his arm outwards, gesturing towards the rainforest that surrounded everyone. "Look around you," he said. "All you see are trees. Papua New Guinea is full of trees. We have an overflow, obaplo, of air." Perceiving this abundance, the countries had sent their emissaries to Papua New Guinea in search of air. The Papua New Guinean government took pity on the countries, Onjani told the villagers, and it had cut a deal. A government-approved company would transport massive gas tanks into the rainforest and pump them full of air. The full tanks would then be shipped to the countries, where the air they contained would be bottled and sold in stores. This, he explained, was carbon trade. "There you get air according to how much you can pay." Onjani smiled, letting the villagers glimpse his superior knowledge of how things work in the countries. "If you don't have a lot of money, you can't get a lot of air, and you'll get short-winded in a hurry." The reason why any of this was of concern to villagers who lived in a backwater swamp was because the pristine rainforest that was their ancestral land was a prime candidate for the air-extracting gas tanks. This was an opportunity, Onjani kept repeating. The villagers' moment had arrived. Carbon trade would earn them mountains of money. Onjani didn't know exactly how many 1,000,000,000 kina, Papua New Guinea's currency, they would receive, but it was sure to be a substantial amount. Plus, the company would bring development into the village. It would need to cut down a lot of trees. The gas tanks, after all, were big and they needed space. And the villagers would be prohibited from hunting game or making gardens on their land. But they wouldn't need to hunt or grow food anymore. The company would give them untold amounts of money, plus a highway and an airstrip. It would build them houses made of corrugated iron and cement, and trade stores, and a tourist center. It would build them a university. All the villagers needed to do was to sign the form that Onjani had unfolded from his net bag and laid out on the floor in front of him. The form was typewritten in English, a language that no villager commands. The fine print specified that 100% of the income from the carbon trade deal would go to a company called Pacific Carbon Trade Limited. The company was owned by Onjani and 3 other men from his village. Those small details were not mentioned by Big Belly at any point during the meeting. He just exhorted the villagers to sign if they wanted to change. And how they wanted to change. If there is a single topic besides sorcery that occupies the villagers' conversations and their minds, it is change. They desperately want to change. But villagers don't just want to change. They want to change into something else. They want to change, I gradually discovered, from black people, like Australian Aborigines, most Papua New Guineans have black skin, into white people. I am a white person. I was born and raised in the United States, but I moved to Sweden when I was 19 years old and have lived there since then. I was a 24-year-old doctoral student when I first arrived in Papua New Guinea in 1985, eager, wide-eyed, and comically inexperienced. I knew very little about Papua New Guinea, and I knew absolutely nothing about life in a tropical rainforest. But I traveled halfway around the globe to Papua New Guinea because I had decided that I wanted to study how a language dies. Papua New Guinea has more languages than any other country in the world. In an area the size of the state of California, and with just over 8 million people, there are almost 1,000 separate languages. Nota bene, separate languages, not just separate dialects or variants. Most of them still undocumented, and many of them spoken by groups of 500 people or fewer. I had been directed to the village by an Australian linguist named Don Laycock. Laycock was an expansive, hard-drinking man of modest hygienic inclination. In the early 1970s, he had traveled the entire lower Sepik region of northern Papua New Guinea by dugout canoe, gathering word lists from speakers of the many languages spoken throughout that area in order to map them and try to classify them. From 2 men he met in a village near the mouth of the mighty Sepik River, Laycock learned that deep in the rainforest lay a single village where a small group of people spoke a language that appeared to be unrelated to any other. The village was called Gapun. Laycock never visited Gapun himself. It was too hard to get to. In fact, before my own trip, only about 10 white people had ever visited the village. A few Australian patrol officers and a couple of German missionaries passed through Gapun in the 1930s and in the decades following the Second World War. All of them remarked on how difficult it was to get to the village, and few of them ever went back. The other white people who made it to Gapun consisted mostly of a few Catholic priests who, starting in the late 1940s, also usually made the journey only once. They typically came to the village, said a quick mass, baptized a few babies, and left, never to return. Only one sturdy old nun based in the Catholic mission station at Marienberg, an 8-hour journey by canoe, persisted in coming, and for decades she arrived in the village once or twice a year on medical patrol. She would stay for one night, setting up a little clinic from which she dispensed chloroquine pills for malaria, squeezed boils, and gave antibiotic injections to anyone who looked in need of one. When I visited the Australian National University in Canberra on my way to Papua New Guinea and knocked on Professor Laycock's office door, seeking advice about where I might do my doctoral research on language death, he suggested that I go to Gapun. He didn't know anything about the village or what might be happening there, he said, but he remembered hearing that the language was minuscule. "It's so small that something has to be happening to it," he reasoned. "Why don't you go and see what?" I followed that advice and found my way to Gapun. The first time I went, in 1985, I stayed for a month to see whether I could manage to live there for longer. Of course, the Gapun villagers were perplexed that a strange white man should arrive out of nowhere one afternoon and announce, in broken Tok Pisin, the language that the villagers are switching to, that he wanted to live with them and write a book about their language. The only books they had ever encountered were the Bible and the notebooks that Australian patrol officers used to carry with them before Papua New Guinea gained independence in 1975. One villager had heard a story about the existence of mysterious objects called comic books. All those books, the villagers were convinced, had magical power to bring forth the money, airplanes, outboard motors, and other cargo that white people had but Papua New Guineans like themselves didn't. That a young white man now suddenly appeared to them talking about a book was intriguing. It was promising. But why in the world had I come to them? Why had I come to Gapun and not some other village? The villagers pondered this question among themselves, and quickly arrived at a conclusion. A few weeks after I arrived, they shared their conclusion with me, revealing the real reason for my coming. I was a dead villager, they informed me, returned to Gapun to lead them down the road to change. The moment they chose to impart this information was far from ideal. It was at night in the middle of a violent thunderstorm. Rain was spattering down hard on the thatch of the house, where I was sitting on the floor together with an unknown number of people. The only light available was the orange glow of the hand-rolled newspaper cigarettes the villagers all smoke, which bobbed around in the blackness like disembodied eyes. Occasionally lightning struck, momentarily freezing everyone into a bloodless, bluish tableau. The whole scene had me on edge. It brought to mind the climax of any number of cheap and gruesome horror films that I had watched late at night growing up. And now, during just such a scene, which always ended with a piercing shriek, I found myself in the thick of a tropical rainforest, in the middle of the night, with no way of getting out, surrounded by people whose grandparents had cut off other people's heads as trophies, being told knowingly that I was dead. I had to stifle a piercing shriek. Despite being told that I was a ghost, though, and despite almost everything else about the village, the omnipresent mud, the clouds of mosquitoes, the villagers have names for 8 different species, the scabies-riddled, hairless, blue-skinned village dogs that I occasionally observed cooling themselves by bathing in the shallow wells from which villagers fetched the water they used for drinking and cooking, and the local food, which consists almost entirely of a kind of glutinous starch that, prepared in the way villagers like it best, is pink and has the consistency of thick mucus. I decided at the end of the month that I would come back to Gapun. The language situation was just as intriguing as Don Laycock had suggested it might be. As far as I was able to tell, no child under 10 seemed to speak the village's indigenous language, Tayap. They all seemed to understand it, but none of the children ever spoke it. Instead, all their speech was in the national language, Tok Pisin. I realized that this was a key moment unlike any other that had been described by researchers who studied language death. Those other studies tended to focus on the last speakers of dying languages. They examined languages that were in their terminal stages, documenting them right before they gave up the ghost and were gone forever. In Gapun, I would be able to look at the beginning of the process of shift. Villagers were raising the first generation of kids who, for some reason, for the first time in the language's history, suddenly were not learning Tayap as their first language. Even more compelling was the villagers' explanation for this sudden tip. When I asked them why their children weren't speaking Tayap, mothers and fathers all insisted that they wanted their children to speak it, and that they were raising their children exactly like their parents had raised them. What had changed, though, those parents told me, was the kids themselves. The children no longer wanted to learn Tayap. They were too big-headed, adults told me, meaning that their kids were too willful and stubborn to speak the language. A mystery congealed. The case of the big-headed babies. I also decided to return to Gapun because I liked the just over 100 people who lived there. I found them hospitable, intriguing, and funny. When they weren't making me anxious with tales of me being dead, they made me laugh. Besides, it was clear that the villagers wanted me to return. By the end of my initial month-long stay, they promised to build me a house, where, they assured me, I would be able to store my belongings without having to worry about things disappearing into the palms of thoughtless children or covetous visitors. And right before I left, the old knowledgeable men, referred to as big men, Olbikman in Tok Pisin, Munjenum Suman in Tayap, dressed me up in feathers and boar's tusks, and they instructed me to drink bespelled water they poured onto a taro leaf. The magic water, they explained, would loosen my tongue and make me speak Tayap, which I had died too young to acquire the last time around. On the same occasion, the men announced that they were bestowing on me a Tayap name. It wasn't the one I'd had in my previous incarnation. Then I had been called Kunji, and I'd passed away when I was only a few months old. The new name the big men decided to confer on reincarnated me was an august one. It was the name of one of the village's founding ancestors. The name was Saraki. I liked it. Its sinuous beginning, interrupted by the sudden guttural stop that glided down the slope of a careening, excited vowel, reminded me of something that J.R.R. Tolkien might have dreamed up for a not entirely benevolent elf. So the following year I went back to Gapun. I spent 15 months there, living in a large and accommodating house on stilts that the villagers built for me. I finished my Ph.D. dissertation and wrote a book about what I had discovered about Tayap and why the language was dying. Since then I have returned 5 times, and all told, I have spent nearly 3 years living in Gapun. The villagers always thought of me as a ghost. I was a pretty useless and recalcitrant ghost, because despite all my years of coming and going, I never revealed the secrets about the road to change that the villagers were all certain I possessed. That didn't stop them from carefully observing my behavior, though, and weighing my words, in the hope that I might slip up one day and let the cat out of the bag. They believe that when they find the road that I had access to, or when they die, whichever comes first, their black skin will crack open like a crab's shell, and they will step out soft and white and rich. Because with white skin will come immediate access to all the money and all the goods that white people have. After Big Belly Onjani was fed and left Gapun later to return home to his own village, 2 hours away by foot, the villagers quietly debated what he had said. The women were derisive. "What will happen to us when the company comes and takes all our air?" they wanted to know. Onjani's declaration that Papua New Guinea had an overflow of air didn't reassure them. "What will happen to the pigs in the rainforest when all our air is gone?" they asked. "What will happen to our sago palms, our banana gardens, our taro, our tobacco? What air will our children breathe?" The men granted that those perhaps were not non-trivial concerns, but they were more conciliatory. 1,000 million kina was an awful lot of money. A highway and an airstrip, too. A university, even. They knew that Onjani was a conniving blowhard who had cheated them out of money many times before.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?